Hello once again, my fellow Jeti users, and this video is about running your Jeti receivers in clone mode. I've been very resistant to doing this because I have never used clone mode and I don't see a need for me to do it. Also, there can be issues getting a receiver out of clone mode back to normal mode. However, I've had a check on it, and so what we're going to do is look at what is clone mode, why would you use clone mode, and we'll look at putting it into clone mode, testing the trainer system, and getting it out of clone mode. Now, the instructions say that you need a Jeti box to get a receiver out of clone mode, and the Jeti box emulator in your transmitter cannot do it because it has lost communication with the receiver. However, there's rumours on the internet that connecting your receiver up to Jeti Studio and reflashing the latest firmware will take it out of clone mode back to normal mode. So I asked Jeti, and the answer from them is the older R receivers will come out of clone mode back into normal mode if you reflash the firmware with Jeti Studio, because it basically resets everything. But the newer REX or REX receivers will not work with Jeti Studio to get out of clone mode back to normal mode, because it doesn't change the settings in the receiver. So you will need a physical Jeti box to get a REX receiver out of clone mode back to normal mode. Whilst playing around with it, I also noticed in the instructions it says that whilst a bind plug is in, it forces the receiver into normal mode. So I put an R receiver, and I tried it with an RSAT receiver as well. Put a bind plug in, bind it, and sure enough, it runs in normal mode for the time that the bind plug is in, and therefore you can go into the transmitter's Jeti box emulator and change it back from clone to normal mode. I do not know if this will work with a REX receiver, so if you go playing around with a REX receiver in clone mode, you take your own risks there if you don't have a Jeti box to physically get it back out of clone mode. Okay, what is clone mode? Well, it's stopping the receiver from sending back any information to the transmitter, so the transmitter no longer knows that the receiver is there. It's not just the standard telemetry like your voltage and your antenna and Q values. It's the entire communication between them. And so you can't use Device Explorer or the Jeti box emulator because they can't see the receiver sending nothing back. It's like the good old days of megahertz radios when the transmitter had no clue if there was anything connected to it. It just transmits blindly, and if there's a receiver out there, fine. So when you switch on your clone receiver, you don't get the usual transmitter beep beep receiver bound, because it doesn't know that the receiver is there. Now you're thinking, what on earth is the point of that? Well, it's not for running your primary receiver. It's for running a secondary receiver. Now you think, well, that's fine. We've got dual path for secondary receivers. What's the point of a clone? Well, there are a couple of times that a clone receiver comes into its own. And one of these is when you want to use the buddy box system or the teacher-pupil system. You can't use that if you're running in dual path mode, because the dual path mode takes both transmitter modules talking to the two receivers, and therefore you haven't got a module to talk to the pupil transmitter. Even if you used cabled buddy box, and if you want to know how to do that, I've got a video or two about that. Even if you use cable buddy box, you can't do it with dual path. So you need to use the default transmission mode, and with default transmission mode you can have as many clone backup receivers as you like, because the transmitter thinks it's only talking to the one primary receiver. So because you're in default, you can then enable the buddy box system even though you've got secondary receivers as a backup into your primary or a backup into your central box. The other situation is that people who fly in places where there is an awful lot of 2.4 gigahertz radio noise report that they get much better A&Q values running in default mode with a clone as the backup than they do running dual path. I've never seen this because where I fly is nice rural environments. The airfield isn't covered by telephone microwave links or industrial strength Wi-Fi's. Even if I go to a jet meeting or a scale glider aerotow meeting, there's maybe a dozen transmitters switched on, something like that. Even if there are 20, it wouldn't be a problem noise floor. But certainly some of the people who fly in parks in or at the edge of American cities where there's an awful lot of powerful RF stuff going on and an awful lot of model flyers turn up compared to what I'm used to seeing at a British club, and they all switch their transmitters on. Noise floor can be very high, and they report that the running in default mode with a clone as the backup gives them far better A&Q results than running in dual path. Okay, let's have a look at what you would do here. And just to prove it all, I'm going to be using a CB200. There's the servo plugged in. Servo works. And at the moment, I've only got one receiver on RSAT of the two plugged in, because that's the one I'm going to show changing over to clone mode. And then we'll come back and plug in the primary and bind that one. Okay, you don't have to be using a central box. You could be using the backup receiver plugged direct into the primary receiver with your servos plugged into the primary receiver. Because the transmitter doesn't know how many clone receivers there are, and you can clone as many as you like, therefore, you could have clones plugged into the primary and secondary receivers, which then go into the central box, but just how far do you take having backup scenarios around? Okay, so here's my receiver. It's bound. I've shown you the servo working. Let's go into, oops, not system, Jeti box emulator. And it's come to this one because I've been playing around with it, but it would have started off somewhere higher up. You find your way into this. I'll tell you what, I'll reset it just because some people will struggle with Jeti box emulator. I'll switch that off, switch it off. And this will hopefully reset the Jeti box emulator so you can see the full path to get into it. Okay, right. Applications, Jeti box, there we go. It starts off at TX. We need to come to the right to get to the next device, which is the receiver. And we can come down and down again. Right, measure is the sort of column heading of the first column. We can go to the right, so we go to the right. Main settings is the header of the second column, and that's the one we want to come down into. So we come down into the settings in main setting. There we are, RX mode normal. Now the exact things that you see coming down that column may differ because of different receivers. That was the one that applies purely to the RSAT. You certainly see slightly different ones in the R receiver, but eventually down near the bottom you get to RX mode normal. There is no right hand button to press, just left button, which is this one. The double arrow means press and hold it down. Press and hold it down. There we are. Switches to clone. Got a warning about it being in clone. And double right arrow, which means if you press and hold down the right button, it'll go to normal mode. Okay, so we do that. Clone mode, say OK. Come out of there. Now, if I switch that off for a moment. Okay. Once you're in clone mode, you do need to rebind it, or certainly I've found that you need to rebind it. The instructions say you need to rebind it. And I found that you do need to, so that's what we're going to do. So I've taken that receiver out now. I've put in its bind plug. I'm going to plug it in. Okay, so it's in. And if we switch on the power to that receiver, there. Okay. Now, as you can see, the receiver's back and running. But something very strange. You're thinking, hang on, I said there's no telemetry. Ah, but remember, I did say, when the bind plug is in, it forces the receiver into normal mode for the time that the bind plug is in. Now, it appears to be bound, but I've had some funny problems with these, so I'm going to go back and force it to be bound again anyway. There we go. Okay, I will now remove the bind plug from that receiver. Take it out from there. Yep, and I'll plug it back in. Okay, well, it's certainly not in normal mode now because it's plugged back in. There we are, and the transmitter is just not seeing it, thinks it doesn't exist. Now, just so that the transmitter doesn't get confused between receivers and what's going on, I'm going to unplug my clone receiver. And now I am going to plug in the primary receiver, power it up, go to Advanced Properties, pair it, say yes. Lovely. Okay, so now the clone's unplugged, the primary's plugged in, it's plugged into RX1, and servo's working quite happily, and we're reporting these values. Okay, I shall switch that all off. I shall plug the clone back in. So now we have the primary plugged into receiver 1, the clone plugged into receiver 2. Let's switch the power back on. There we are. So the transmitter's quite happy. It's seeing the only receiver it knows about, which is receiver 1, or the default receiver. There we are, it's working. Now, if all has gone well, I should be able to unplug receiver 1 and the system still works. Well, the transmitter will warn us that it's lost receiver. So we'll unplug that. There we go. See, the transmitter is warning us telemetry lost because the one receiver it's been bound to in default mode is gone. We're running on our clone here, but it's still working. The central box sees the signal on receiver 1 has gone, so it's switched over to receiver 2, which is there. The transmitter may not know about it, but it's busy receiving what the transmitter is sending out. And we can prove that if I plug RX1 back in, at least shut up its alarms, we'll go into Device Explorer. And there is the one and only RSAT it knows about, because it doesn't know about the clone one. Let's look in Central Box 200. Let's look in its general settings. Can you see down here, receiver inputs? A central box receiver inputs auto-detect the type of data they're getting. You don't need to set those. You need to set the output from the RSATs or the receivers to XBus, but the central box receiver inputs will auto-detect whether it's UDI, PPM, XBus, or whatever. And so there we go. Receiver 2 is getting XBus. I'll prove it. I'll unplug it. bit crude, I know, but there we go. Watch this. In a moment, there we go. It knows it's not getting any data there anymore because it's lost it. So now we'll plug our clone back in to RX2. Come back here. See, very quickly it's switched on. It's recognized it's getting the X-bus data, which we proved anyway by unplugging the one and only primary, or not primary, the only receiver as far as the transmitter is concerned, from RX1, and it's still running happily on the clone. So there we go. Lovely. Now, if all is well, I said that the training system should work. So let's do that. Come out of here, and I'm going to switch on the DS12, which is kindly lent to me by Bernie Jones at eSoaring Gadgets in the UK, or also Jeti UK, just for the very purpose of making things like this. And we'll go to Advanced Properties, Wireless Modes Trainer, and I'm going to change this to Teacher. And in the DS12, I'll go Advanced Properties, Wireless Modes Trainer, change it to Student, and pair the primary module. Yes, pair the primary module of the DS12. Say yes. No, there we go. I was choosing the wrong one. Should have been the secondary. Okay. Now then, trainer switch. I'll set that one. And come down here, and it's the throttle that's plugged into at the moment. Replace. Switch that off. Okay. Yeah, switch that on. The secondary has it. Good. So I've set up my trainer. Let's have a look. Buddy box off. Bring the servo close up here. Operate the throttle. That's fine. And on the trainer, the pupil doesn't work. I'll switch over. The buddy box is now on. And if I move the pupil, the throttle works. And if I move the teacher, the throttle doesn't work. So far, so good. But will it still work if we unplug the primary receiver and just run on the clone? Out we pop. That proves it's lost that. So, buddy box off. See, the teacher is still talking to there. That's good. What happens if we switch over to the buddy box? No teacher, but the pupil. Yep. So there you are. It works. See, that's the receiver that the transmitter is talking to in default mode. But we can still use buddy box with two receivers, the backup receiver, and it's working. So there you go. That proves that the whole system works as advertised that way. So you can use buddy box with two receivers, just that you run it in default with a clone rather than dual path method. There. Have fun with that, folks.